Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. I want to shift gears. I want to get back to the campaign in just a moment, but I want to talk for a few minutes. We haven't talked about developments in the whole issue of the homosexual agenda, and I want to talk a little bit about that here in the next few minutes. One of the things I've said, and I will say it again, is America is going to have to choose between homosexuality and liberty, because it is not possible for us to have both. Every advance of the homosexual agenda comes at the expense of religious liberty. Another thing that I've often said is that once you break the threshold of man-woman marriage as the legitimate union where sexual intimacy can be expressed, and up until, the 1960s and 1970s, there was a universal understanding in Western civilization that the only relationship in which sexual expression was legitimate and had society's approval was the marriage relationship between one man and one woman. We frowned as a culture on sexual promiscuity. We knew what happened. We didn't approve of it. We frowned on adultery. We knew what happened. We didn't approve of it. People that were caught were embarrassed. We frowned on homosexuality. It was aberrant behavior. It was sexual deviancy. We knew it happened, but we didn't approve of it. We frowned on pedophilia. We frowned on incest. We frowned on bestiality. But all of that is changing now because of the push from the homosexual agenda. Now, we've had the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It's just crossed the first anniversary. September 20 was the first anniversary of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Now, the military's out there saying, hey, this is no problem, been without a hitch. Well, the reason is the only people that the military will allow to speak about the effect of Don't Ask, Don't Tell are members of the military that approve of it. If any military member has a problem with it, they are not allowed to speak. They stick a bag over their head, stick a sock in their mouth, and say you're not allowed to express that opinion anywhere. So that's why it looks like this thing is moving forward without a hitch. But here's a piece from the Baptist Press, Chaplain Alliance for Religious Liberty. This is an organization that represents more than 2,000 chaplains who serve the armed forces, and they are already developing an extensive catalog of negative consequences that have followed from the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Now, we got Paul Ryan out there today. I'm very disappointed to read this because Mitt Romney's already thrown in the towel on overturning the repeal. Mitt Romney said, not going to touch it. Paul Ryan came out today, and he's been in favor of reinstating the ban. And now apparently under directions from headquarters, he said, no, I got no problem with it. It's here to stay. Not interested in dealing with it if we get into power. So that's extremely, extremely disappointing to me personally to see Paul Ryan kind of throw in the towel on that issue. Because this chaplain group is developing a list of some of the consequences just in the chaplain corps. Here's a chaplain that was encouraged by military officials to resign his commission unless you, quote, can get in line with the new policy. So you can't get with the program here, then you need to find another line of work. Another chaplain was threatened with early retirement and then was reassigned so he could be more closely supervised because he'd expressed his concerns about the policy change. Here's a senior chaplain stripped of his authority over the chapel because he said the chapel is a sacred space and marriage-like ceremonies are not going to be performed here. The only ceremonies going to be performed in this chapel are weddings between one man and one woman. So it's already becoming a problem, especially in the chaplain corps where we knew they were going to get the brunt of this. And we've got other instances where, for instance, this is from a piece on the Washington Times by Ron Cruz, who works with this chaplain's outfit. And he points out, look, the reason you're not hearing any criticism from the military is military officials aren't allowing anybody that's got a problem with it to speak. And he points out that there were 2 airmen who were harassed in a post-exchange food court as they were privately discussing their concerns about the impact of repeal. So their meal got interrupted. They got harassed. Well, they're just trying to exchange their concerns about the new policy. An officer at an officer training school, a male serviceman sexually harassed another male serviceman through text messages, emails, phone calls, and in-person confrontations. The harassing male insisted that the two would, quote, make a great couple, end quote. The harassed serviceman reported the harassment, but the command failed to take disciplinary action. Why? Because they didn't want to get tagged as homophobic bigots. Service members engaged in homosexual behavior protested a service school's open door policy for all students. So there's a service school, one of the military academies, I assume, he's kind of discreet about that, that's got an open door policy. You can't have the door closed to your room because we don't want illicit sexual activity going on behind closed doors. And so homosexuals are now out there openly complaining about that. And the Navy is allowing sailors who are homosexual to choose their own bunkmates. And remember, the concern that we expressed from the very beginning is what's going to happen to when you have this kind of sexual tension in these close living quarters, and sailors have to share living quarters that are as intimate and compact as anybody in the military. Got another story here about a protocol officer for a general at the U.S. Central Command at MacDill Air Force Base, Tampa, Florida, has been arrested for allegedly trying to entice a 17-year-old boy into sexual activity. So here's a Jerry Sandusky type. He's a protocol officer for a general at U.S. Central Command. I mean, near the top of the food chain here. And so expect to see a lot more of this. Remember, we've talked about the fact that homosexuals commit crimes against children, sex crimes against children, at about 10 times the rate of the heterosexual population. There's this proclivity toward the abuse of children. Homosexuals comprise about 2% of the population, but they're responsible for 33% of all instances of child sexual molestation. So now that they're allowed to openly serve and they can't be disciplined in any way for what they do, expect to see more instances of pedophilia now in the United States military because they've got a protected place to serve there. And meanwhile, France is out there eliminating the words mother and father from documents. Again, this is to push same-sex marriage and to push adoption rights for homosexual couples. And again, we've talked about this before many times, but Mark Regnerus, University of Texas, he did this extensive study with adults who had grown up in same-sex households. He compared them with children that had grown up in heterosexual households raised by a biological mom and a dad married to each other. He measured 80 outcomes of these homosexuals, or these not homosexuals, they're adults, some of them homosexual, but most of them not, that had grown up in same-sex households. And he discovered that the children who had grown up in same-sex households did worse on 77 out of the 80 outcomes compared to children that were raised in intact biological two-parent families. So it's a killer for kids. It ought to break our hearts to know what's going to happen to children that are raised in same-sex households. You might be familiar with the actor Rupert Everett. Now he's getting some flack. He's an open homosexual himself. But listen to this. Rupert Everett, he is a homosexual. He's not a member of the radical, extreme far right. He is an out and practicing homosexual. He says, quote, "I can't think of anything worse than being brought up by two gay dads." It's a gay actor saying that. The worst thing I can imagine is a child being brought up by two gay dads. Now, he says his mom, he's taken his boyfriend to meet his mom, and she likes him, but his mom still wishes I had a wife and kids. Quote, "She thinks children need a father and a mother, and I agree with her." And again, the quote, "I can't think of anything worse than being brought up by two gay dads." And then, of course, the story from The Blaze naturally quotes some executive of a gay rights group saying, hey, there's no evidence that kids of gay parents suffer in the way they are being brought up. Well, I just went over the Mark Regner study. They do worse in 77 out of 80 outcomes. And then one of the things I've mentioned before repeatedly is that there's just no place to stop. Once you accept and approve of domestic unions, sexual unions, other than the sexual union of a husband and wife in marriage, there simply is no place to stop. And here is a long piece that's published on Gawker. And remember, what homosexual activists are trying to tell us is they're born this way. Nothing they can do about it. It's in the genes. They're born this way. They can't do a single solitary thing about it. And we've raised the question, well, what is going to stop people that want to protect pedophiles from saying the same thing about them? This is simply their sexual orientation. They were born this way. They can't help themselves. And everybody said, oh, you're just being silly. You're just being ridiculous. That's hyperbole. That'll never happen. Well, this story on Gawker, 7-page article, is about a number of researchers, many of them in Canada, listen to this, whose work suggests that pedophilia is an illness deserving of the public sympathy the way any brain disorder is. Some of the scientists say pedophilia is a sexual orientation, just like homosexuality, meaning that it's unchangeable regardless of how much jail time or beatings or therapy someone is dealt. Others have reason to believe that pedophiles are born that way. If this research proves to be correct, it should help shape both our public policy and our public attitude, so we're protecting kids while also protecting pedophiles from angry mobs, cellmates, and themselves. And these aren't yahoos. One of these guys is Dr. Vernon Quinsey of the Queen's University, and Dr. Hubert Van Heijshem, who is retired from the University of Montreal. So these guys are professionals. They're not yahoos saying just another sexual orientation, just like homosexuality, nothing to see here, move along. And then you got Hollywood director Nick Cassavetes. He's now saying that nobody should have a problem with incest. That's okay. Hey, if they're not having kids, they love each other, why is it any of your business? So, ladies and gentlemen, as we told you, once you break the threshold of marriage as a union of one man and one woman, there is no place to stop. Pedophilia, incest is next. Back in 2.